Good day to you. Welcome to the 100th International Macro History Online Seminar. We're delighted to have an excellent panel of speakers today. Joining us to talk about geoeconomics is Dale Copeland of the University of Virginia, Jesse Schreger of Columbia University Business School, and Christoph Trebesch of Kiel University and Kiel Institute. Um, our first speaker will be Jesse Schreger, Associate Professor of Business in the Economics Division at Columbia um, University Business School. His research focuses on international finance and macroeconomics, particularly sovereign debt, exchange rates, and global capital flows. I'm delighted he can join us today to talk about the long view on geoeconomics. And our second speaker will be Christoph Trebesch, who is professor of macroeconomics at Kiel University and director of the Research Center on International Finance at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, where his work spans sovereign debt, global capital flows, and the geopolitics of finance. Related to our panelists today, he's also the director of the Kiel Institute's initiative on geoeconomics. So I will turn the floor over to Jesse and look forward to a robust discussion afterwards. I should say that after we'll have the Q&A space open for questions. I'll be collecting questions. If there's a clarifying question, just put a pound clarification in front of it. Otherwise, we'll stop after about 45 minutes and I'll present questions and then we'll move into a more informal Q&A at the top of the hour. Jesse, the floor is yours. Thanks.
So thank you so much for the introduction. It's great to be here, and particularly for the 100th installment of this great online seminar series. Um, so I want to start, with the idea of geoeconomics. So at this point, geoeconomics is an activity that really shapes the world we live in. So it can range from say when Norway recognized the Chinese human rights leader, suddenly Norwegian exports of salmon to China fell to zero. You can think about the threats to cut Russia off from SWIFT, the Liberation Day tariffs. It's kind of been a term that can span many of the new innovations that are driving the world. But I want to start with kind of a definition, at least how I think of geoeconomics, which is hegemonic countries using their economic strength from existing financial and trade relationships to achieve geopolitical and economic goals. And so, kind of the most recent and most pressing, example of this in that we've seen in the news is China unveiling the kind of massive rare earth export controls, essentially to prevent the U.S. from putting major tariffs in. That it is essentially a threat that if the U.S. doesn't comply with Chinese demands, well, then all of a sudden, China's control of rare earths can be used to kind of control the U.S. economy or disrupt activities in other ways. And so, given kind of the subject of today's talk, I actually wanted to start with kind of the not the history of geoeconomics, but actually kind of the history of geoeconomics in economics. And so I really think of kind of the starting point of this is the seminal contribution of Albert Hirschman, national power and the structure of foreign trade. And one thing that obviously we kind of this book gets cited plenty in economics, usually for the Hirschman-Herfindahl index, but a lot of the kind of ideas that we're really discussing now when we talk about the pursuit of geoeconomic power are kind of appearing in the original Hirschman text, kind of written trying to understand geoeconomics more broadly, and specifically the way in which Nazi Germany really used geoeconomic power in the build up to the Second World War. Now, what is the graph showing? The graph is showing that in the early days, this was a incredibly important book and cited within economics. Now, as you can see, over time, what happened is this actually became kind of a foundational text of international political economy in political science. But you can see kind of the share of citations of this book that appear in economics versus political science really went down. So, this is not to say that this was forgotten. The ideas were incredibly prominent in political science, but it's really only been, kind of recently that we've started seeing, these ideas return to economics. And I think that this is an area where economics does have a lot to add to the great work that's occurred in political economy. And so one of the ways in which I kind of want to highlight how you can really kind of operationalize some of the ideas that appear in the original Hirschman book, which is the question of kind of dependence. And so this is work with Kris and Matteo, where we want to really look at, okay, what are the kind of the bases of geoeconomic power of, say, the US led coalition, so think the US, Western Europe, Canada, against, say, the Chinese coalition, China, Russia, Iran, others. The kind of key way in which we really start to understand geoeconomics is the question of, well, how much can you harm the activities or threaten to harm the activities of an adversary if you threaten to kind of take away the inputs that you control. And so one of the real ideas that came out of Hirschman was, well, the threat the threat of a loss of an input really depends on a few things: how important the input is in your production, how much you spend on it, how easy it is to substitute away from, and then really how much of an input you actually control. And so, we're kind of used to in economics thinking about the elasticity of substitution of a good. But one of the things that really comes out when you think of geoeconomics is, an input can be hard to substitute because technologically, it's very hard to find a close replacement. I think that's where we tend to think of these cutting edge semiconductors. There's no real substitute for what's being produced by TSMC. But in another dimension, you can think of oil or rare earths, where we could estimate a very high elasticity of substitution between, say, the oil produced in Canada and the oil produced in Mexico. But if a coalition of countries is able to cut off, say, all oil, and all of a sudden we're thinking of substituting between oil and natural gas, all of a sudden, kind of the relevant question of how easy it is to substitute can change. And so one of the things that we calculated here was, well, how close to a monopoly are the US coalition and the Chinese coalition in kind of two very broad classes of goods? So the dark green line is in the control of international finance. Dashed orange is basically everything else. And so there's a few things to say. So first, in goods and services, the US coalition is still generally larger. However, what's really jumps out here is that the American-led coalition maintains a near monopoly on the provision of international finance. So there's this question of being cut off by the West. It's very hard to substitute to other forms of goods. For the Chinese coalition, there's very little control of finance. And now there are plenty of goods and services where they'd have a large share, but it's not kind of broad based. And the question I think the world is grasping with this rare earth threat is how small of a good can you really be a monopolist in, where that threat to take it away causes kind of massive disruption. So we kind of use a model we developed to ask how much, if the US and China basically took away their inputs, how much damage would be caused to countries around the world? And most importantly, is that coming from the loss of goods and services or finance? And kind of the key thing we find is that even though finance is a fairly small expenditure share, because the US is a monopolist and the US coalition is a near monopolist, much of the American kind of power is coming from finance, contrasting that with the Chinese coalition, where much of the power is coming from goods and services. Now, that's kind of taking a model-driven approach to, say, measuring where geoeconomic power comes from. One of the things we're really working on is how we can actually zoom down to the firm level and ask, kind of the nature of pressure. So it's kind of using large language models to ask, which firms are affected by which pressure, from who to who, and why. And so I want to give you not a full history, but kind of the last 20 years of how you can actually use this inference to kind of measure who is pressuring who around the world. And so, very quickly, what do we actually do? The idea of kind of this approach to measuring geoeconomic pressure is essentially to treat a corpus of text, earnings calls and analyst reports, and act as if we are able to use a large language model to run kind of a firm survey. So we're going to use a local GPU infrastructure with open weight models so that it's all completely replicable. And we'll have a series of prompts about basically the tools of geoeconomic pressure: export control, sanctions, tariffs. We also look at things like investment restrictions. But essentially, we take, say, a firm earnings call. Picture ASML, the Dutch producer of machine tools for semiconductors. And you can ask them, well, are you affected by US export? Are you affected by export controls? Yes. Who's imposing that? It'll either be, say, the US or the Netherlands. Who's targeted? China. Then what's interesting is you can actually go on down and ask them, well, how are you responding? Are you raising your investment? Are you cutting your investment? Where? Where are you moving your supply chains towards or away from? And so you can essentially, by using these large language models, try to actually see how firms are being pressured all around the world, by each of these tools. And so, coming to this ASML example, we know in reality, one of the big objectives of both the Trump and then the Biden administration was essentially to get ASML to stop providing these machine tools to China because, they're the sole manufacturer of, the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines needed to produce cutting edge semiconductors. When you take ASML earnings calls and you ask, well, who's imposing these controls? It's, the US, they're a Dutch company. Also, the Netherlands is eventually persuaded by the US to come along. You always classify China as being on the recipient side. You can see that the LLM will return the correct products being targeted. You see the firm is hurt through lower sales in China. And so this is kind of one example of how this would work. But you can really combine this inference across the 800,000 documents and put it together for kind of a recent history of the use of sanctions for pressure around the world, measured as what share of firms are reported as being affected by different forms of sanctions. So if you go back before 2014, kind of the only prominent case from 2008 to 2014 where major publicly traded global firms were discussing being affected was American sanctions on Iran. With the JCPOA, those Iranian sanctions stopped being a salient, point of discussion. Following, Russia's annexation of Crimea, you see kind of a range of U.S. and European sanctions on Russia. In the first Trump administration, you see this explosion of sanctions, essentially with the Trump withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. You see the return of sanctions on Iran. You also start to see the U.S. sanctioning ZTE and Huawei, the Chinese firms, to essentially slow them down for telecommunications equipment. And then following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, you start to see 10% of firms saying they're affected by sanctions, both from the US and Europe. When you turn to export controls, you can also get kind of a picture, changing picture of the use of these tools over the last 20 years. Starting in 2010, this is when there was a territorial dispute between China and Japan. That's the first time China threatened to cut off, rare earths. That's the little yellow there in 2010. But it's really with the first Trump administration that you start to see a huge increase in export controls of the United States to China. But recently, and actually for the first time, we've actually seen that more firms were actually discussing being affected by China's potential restriction on rare earths to the U.S. So you're starting to see that this is not only a tool of the United States. For the use of tariffs around the world, I don't have to say much, that it's the U.S. essentially imposing these tariffs on China, and then recently on other countries. But you can kind of get this firm to firm, take this firm to firm measure and actually see source and destination of where pressure is being applied. But I think kind of the most what we really want to understand is that now that these tools are being used broadly as a major form of economic statecraft, for us the big question is, how are firms actually responding to these? And this is where I really think that kind of the use of large language models can help us understand the response to these forms of pressure. And so here, what we essentially do is we ask firms, we separate them. Are you in the country imposing pressure? So this is if the US is putting export controls on China, American firms will be on the left. The right panel is if you're in the country receiving pressure. So if the US is cutting China off from semiconductors, Chinese firms would be in the right bin. And what we can do is we can ask firms, let's start with green and export controls. You ask firms, okay, Chinese firms, targeted for export controls, how are you responding? Over 30% of firms are saying that they're responding to these export controls by undertaking R&D, and that goes along with increases in investment and increases in domestic investment. Now, some American firms, you can see the green bar, in the left panel. Some American firms like NVIDIA are also saying they're undertaking R&D. This is NVIDIA basically saying we need to develop new products that are, epsilon below the threshold for export controls, but it's not nearly as much as R&D is growing in the targeted countries. And you can kind of separate that from, the way in which firms would say they're affected by tariffs, where, in the country imposing pressure, you do disproportionately see both the input prices rising and sales prices rising. And so, kind of going forward, I think that these kind of, nebulous concepts of how are firms responding to this pressure is actually going to become, measurable. So that let me conclude. So I really can't think of a more pressing global challenge that economists should be studying. There's so much more to do. There's much more to understand theoretically. How are kind of two hegemons competing? What are the domestic constraints, the geoeconomic power projection? Something Christoph's been thinking a lot. How does this kind of complement military force? I think that now we have the opportunity to bring kind of large scale data on economic interdependence to bear on these questions, and I do think that this is really a case where kind of modeling is particularly useful because you see the reaction to say China putting threatening to put rare earths controls in the U.S. This question of, well, how bad is that? That would really be a question where theory has a lot to offer, and so I hope that kind of going forward, this is an area where we can make progress. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jesse. And we'll collect questions again in the chat window. So please add your questions there. And then I'll turn the floor over to Christoph now.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you see the slides?
You might go full screen. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thanks a lot for the kind invitation and for giving me the opportunity to, make a few remarks. I Let me start by saying that I'm very thrilled about how the field has been developing. When we started this, I remember a conversation with Jesse 4 years ago when it wasn't clear at all that this would become a proper field. I think we're now, that question has been answered. It's been very thriving. I'm seeing a lot of interest by excellent juniors entering the field, but also seniors are increasingly interested. People approach me for teaching slides. So it's really changed very much from these first days, like 4 or 5 years ago. And there's been tremendous progress. I'd like to focus today a little bit on the gaps of where I think we need more research on. I'm going to give like a very broad overview of what geoeconomics is in a very succinct way, and then talk more about the gaps. And I think in one sentence, I think the biggest gap, and Jesse was already alluding to it, is that we probably need to move beyond thinking about economic weapons to actually think about actual weapons, to think about the defense dimension, the security dimension of this, because we are unfortunately in a state of the world where clouds are darkening. We're seeing the return of international war. We're seeing the return of global conflicts and of great power rivalry in a very serious way. And for this reason, I fear, have no longer the luxury to focus just on sanctions, just on export controls, on the classic geoeconomic tools that, as a Western government, these days more likely to use, and instead think about, how leaders that we are confronted with use geoeconomics in a much broader and more aggressive way, including these defense dimensions. Okay, let me give you the kind of one differential. Jesse very nice has this excellent definition of geoeconomics, which is probably conceptually cleaner than the one we are proposing in our own survey, which is a very broad one, right? So the main difference between Jesse's focus or the Clayton Marjorie Schreger definition of focusing on leveraging economic strengths to achieve geopolitical and economic goals is that we explicitly include the military dimension, right? The defense dimension. In a way, that also fits their criterion if you interpret it very broadly. But I think we have this, more vague but bigger helm how we understand geoeconomics, and I think we intentionally do that because we fear that leaving defense economics out, that leaving military economics out, really keeps out a very important part of the way leaders, especially rogue and unconstrained leaders, think about these issues, right? So I think we are proposing to move more towards this question of defense and military, and would include it in the broad helm of geoeconomics, although it might be conceptually cleaner to just focus on the geoeconomic tools. Okay, this is so in two books, Jesse very much focused on Albert Hirschman's amazing, seminal contribution. The book I would also see in this arena that I would also recommend to look at is the book by Alan Bolar, Economists at War, which, emphasizes just how much economists have been asked and have contributed to the war effort to military economics to question of defense economics. Okay, and we shouldn't forget that Alfred Hirschman. I'm just reading his biography at the moment. It's a very fat one, but he. What I learned is that he came before writing this book. He was actually intrigued, and the seeds of this book were actually his analysis of the of the fascist Italian military buildup and the international economic linkages that that created problems there. The autarky by Mussolini created all sorts of problems for this military machinery. So he was, some of his motivating studies for this book actually came out of this military economics analysis. So I think again, trying to emphasize that these two fields of geoeconomics using economic weapons, sanctions, embargoes, export controls, that we should think them along with military economics and actual weapons. These are just two surveys. I strongly recommend the paper by Clayton, Majori, and Schreger in the that came out in the macro annual. We also have a paper surveying the literature, with I think the two are very nicely complementary. So just for you to get a sense, if you're interested in getting into this field, these two I think are good starting points. In our survey, we focus on 5 subfields of geoeconomics. So many of you might think, what is actually geoeconomics, right? So the definition was given by Jesse, and I added this broader perspective. But I think the 5 key areas that we should think about as geoeconomics in our survey, at least, is first the classic, the geoeconomic policy tools using sanctions and embargoes. Second, the geopolitics of international trade, especially questions of coercion and fragmentation, but also think about the questions of war and trade. Is actually globalization supportive of peace, or is the opposite true? These are questions that have long intrigued economists and political scientists alike. Then we have the geopolitics of international finance, which focuses on questions of currency dominance or state-directed capital flows, both private flows that are influenced by state actors and official flows that are often, off the radar screen, but actually quite large. And now with the US bailing out Milei, also back in US fashion. Then you have geopolitical risk and its spillovers, right? So this question of how there's this excellent the index that you all know by Caldara and Iacoviello, which has been used to study the spillovers of geoeconomic risk on the domestic economy, right? So what does it mean for GDP, for investments, for banks, and et cetera, et cetera. And this is the fifth point I'd like to emphasize, the economics of war and defense. So military production, procurement, and military supply chains. Okay, on the question of geoeconomics, I think we've made enormous progress, and we're still, there's so much great work in the pipeline on these classic tools, right? Export, investment controls, embargoes. What there is less of is research that, combines all these different dots, right? So to take a holistic view on all these different tools and ask, so which ones are most effective given my situation, my political and economic state, which cause the least collateral damage? How do these coercive tools interact, right? Are they substitutes? Are they complements? We've so we've just seen the paper by Jesse that does an important step in that direction by combining all these different tools. I think we need much more of that. And this is the main point I want to make. I think we need to move away from purely focusing on these classic economic weapons and take the perspective of an authoritarian leader, of which unfortunately we are confronted with, or you can call them unhinged or unconstrained leaders, and to think about the whole range of tools that they can use, right? So this is where we've done most research on, right? This is the economic sanctions, economic incentives. This might be aid, These might be the tools we've all like we've studied, like embargoes and controls that we've used. But there's these others, tools that move stepwise towards actual warfare, that are used by these leaders: cyber attacks, sabotage, industrial espionage, military aid, up to sponsoring insurgency and terrorism. And a leader like Vladimir Putin might not be, thinking only about that. In fact, we know that he's not. In fact, that he's using these other tools, and that when such a leader invests $1 into a kind of a coercive action towards another state, that leader is likely to think about the whole kind of range of coercive tools. So I think we need to think these stronger together. We need to, move out of this box of just using focusing on economic weapons, and take into account these other options, and study their effectiveness, and study what the effect on our own economies are. The other major field that I'd like to highlight is, the geopolitics of international finance, the return of the state. So I see that we see that states have a growing imprint on global finance in many dimensions. So central banks are now the main holders of sovereign bonds. We see that these new creditor powers, the new rich, or the new emerging powers, the new countries that are getting rich, are all more prone to use state tools when they invest abroad, right? Therefore, we expect a increasing politicization of global finance. We expect more of interventions in global financial flows. So in a sense, I mean, the last 50 years have been exceptional, because we really could assume away these geopolitical factors when we studied capital flows. I think these times are to some degree over, and therefore we're seeing more and more imprint of state interventions, both on in Western countries and in emerging countries that are very prone to use these their state banks, their sovereign wealth funds when interacting abroad. So there are many open questions. Again, I don't have too much time, but this is certainly a very exciting field of research. But I think even more important, possibly for our current predicament in Europe especially, is to think more about military economics and defense. To put this in perspective, I just read an impressive CEPR report asking, so what does the new NATO spending target mean? And it would mean they have this projection. We are currently among the NATO countries spending 1.5 trillion US dollars per year on defense. If we are really aiming for this 3.5% of GDP target that was decided in June of this year, they are projecting this will increase to 3 trillion. It will double over the next decade, the annual spending on defense and on the military. And thus far, these literally trillions of dollars go largely unscrutinized by economists. I mean, there's very, very few defense economists out there. If you want to put together a panel, it's not obvious who you're going to invite. There's just not many people who are working on this. And given you look back at the time of Hirschman, at the time of Keynes, Hicks, all these people working in this area, and the American Economic Review, Econometric, they were all full of papers on defense, on war economics, on military economics. And I think to some degree we need to go back to doing serious work on this field, because there's just too much money on the table. There's too much resources being poured into this field for economists not to be more heavily engaged. And there are many, many open questions, right? I mean, think of it, $3 trillion every year spent on this, and there's very little at the moment that we are actively saying on all these questions of what's the right level of defense spending. Is actually does this NATO target make any sense? How what are the opportunity costs of this? What are the economic impacts? How can we maximize the societal benefits? In what kind of weapon systems or technologies should we invest? How could we best foster defense innovation? What is, our market-driven approaches better? Should we kind of follow the Chinese example and do state-driven VC funding of this? Is the private only system better? So there are many, many questions how to set the right incentives for these weapons to actually be produced in an efficient way. How can we avoid producing, basically rearming for war of 20 years ago? How can we make sure that we remain at the technological frontier? Procurement is a field, which is massive, not just on the military side, which is receiving relatively little attention, and yet it's really crucial. So mass production versus bespoke procurement, what's the auction design we have to choose? But even questions of like labor economics, how to retain or recruit people for the military in Europe, right? These are questions where economists can really make a difference, can really scrutinize what policymakers are currently doing, and I think we do far too little of that. So that's probably my main call for action, if you want, to the younger scholars listening. Just to put this into perspective, this is from an ongoing project with Johannes Marzian and myself that puts this kind of guns versus butter in perspective. And when we look at, we are here, this is showing for 20 large economies, think of the usual advanced economies plus two other great powers, Russia and China. We look at military spending to GDP over these more than 100 years. And you can see that pretty much throughout all of history, we had higher military spending. And yet we had never, we are spending so much on welfare and health, and there's so much research being done for right reason on these fields. But there's actually quite a bit of research also being done on education and research, but there's almost nothing or very little on this blue line in terms of scrutinizing and it's likely to go up. So we are in a world where this might actually double, and we therefore need, we think, move away from this times where basically this was not a field of relevance, and instead go back to a time when we actually took this seriously and poured our intellectual and time resources into it. With that, just one last moment of self-advertisement. This is just a survey that came out. If you're interested on the link between geoeconomics and conflict, we've tried to put out a research agenda there, where we think the interesting questions are why we think geoeconomics should not be studied in isolation, but that we have to link it to conflict economics, to defense economics, and this is with more details on what I've just said. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christoph. Quickly, Jesse, did you want to react first to anything Christoph said, or would you prefer me to open to the floor?
Oh no, I mean, happy to open the floor. I actually go on the definition thing, since I feel like Christoph and I have discussed this one for years. In some sense, where to draw the line, I don't think particularly matters. But I guess, I'll say my logic on, or our logic on why we wanted to take the more narrow definition of, going back to the conversation we had years ago. It was when you start doing, now the world has moved here that research on this no longer seems weird. It now is this, growing area where you see all of this burgeoning research. But when it began, and this was, looking at these topics was kind of not what was kind of a standard research question in economics, saying exactly why this wasn't international political economy, why this wasn't just international relations, I think was helpful. That said, on the substance of how much you need to integrate military and defense concerns into geoeconomic analysis, I couldn't agree more. I think that a lot of times when you're now studying these issues, whenever there's a question of, say, credibility, I think economists are naturally inclined to go for credibility of monetary policy, like what can make a policy time consistent. But when you actually think of, say, geoeconomic power projection, like one of the things that makes whether or not a geoeconomic pressure could be credible is whether there's the ability for the other power to respond militarily. I think there is a reason why you don't see small countries necessarily cutting the US off from essential inputs, even if they, we would say that you should be able to extract some sort of surplus. And to me, that's at least where you really see, even if we would take the more narrow definition of geoeconomics that we use, even in that context, I just couldn't agree more with Christoph that when you actually think about what would allow a country to project power, geoeconomically, I think it's impossible to completely abstract from the military dimension. I think what Christoph and his co-authors are doing to kind of link those together is, one of the most important ways this entire field can make progress. So we might not have the exact same definition, but I'm incredibly positive on, the whole agenda and what Christoph just said.
Um, Christoph, you're welcome to respond, or I can
Well,
follow up.
I can just,
Go on forever.
no, no, you can. Why don't you go ahead? I mean, I
Okay.
can just only second what just said, and
Yeah.
that is really the combination of the two, which is very promising. Yeah.
Yeah, I may come back to some of the questions and comments Jesse just raised, but let me go to the floor first and put some of the questions from our audience out there. So Camille Blanco asks, can we trace a parallel between the emergence of Germany as an industrial power in the mid to late 1800s and the confrontation between France and Great Britain with Germany, with the current confrontation between the West and China slash BRICS? And I think either of you can take these questions, both of you, however you want to do it.
I
Do you want to
I just cut
preference?
the slide that would have been perfect, which is a slide from a paper on hegemonic globalization where you just recycle an existing power index, and the slide is called "Why Geoeconomics? Why is the geoeconomics back?" Um, what it does is to, project from an existing index of relative geopolitical power, um, how large the gap between the leader in the system and the follow-ups are, right? And you can see that there's basically uh, at the moment, we are seeing that the gap has been as narrow as it hasn't been for more than 100 years. So you have to go back to the interwar years to see a situation when should the first and the second power, now China and the US, then UK, and the various follow-ups, China, Germany, and France. Um, so we are living in a world with no clear hegemon anymore, right? At least not in the sense of the 70s or 80s when the US was leading. And I think, the the tensions we are seeing is indeed very related to the rise of new powers, right? Back then it was Germany rising, and today it is China and other emerging powers. And this is, I think, one of the central reasons why we are having this panel, why this field is emerging. I think, th this is another super interesting question, right? Why is it that hegemons turn aggressive, and when do they do so, right? And I think there's much indication that they're more likely to turn aggressive when they're threatened. Their hegemony, their power is threatened. The UK was preparing all these aggressive memos. The Admiralty at the time, in the late 19th century, they were starting to leverage their economic power, for example, on undersea telegraph lines, right? So they started, for decades, they were just using them. Everybody was happy, and nobody was, even thinking about that these could be weaponized. And at some point, it turned to weaponize them. And I think that has a lot to do with the rise of Germany and these new competitors, right? And I think this is why another reason we might be having another panel on geoeconomics, in 5 years in a similar setting, because it's not going away. This fundamental shifts are staying.
So Chris Meisner asks, going back to the 19th century or pre-World War II period, what are the main episodes where great powers use their powers to coerce other economies? So his view is it seems that Great Britain was largely hesitant to do so, and that trade sanctions were minimal and financial sanctions were mostly private initiatives. So what factors have changed that have led to the increased intensity of these types of policies by nation states, presumably?
So I guess I think it depends. This goes back to the definition of how broad you want to make geoeconomics. I mean, do we want to put the imperial preference system of the British Empire under a form of geoeconomics? I could see there's a sense in which that inducement of imperial preference was a way to gain these sorts of extractions. I think when we look at the present day and we think of kind of the risk, coming back to Christoph's point of connecting military with this, you do see, I think the scary episode is the U.S. oil embargo on Japan in prior to Pearl Harbor, of the idea that was that is using the economic strength in order to presumably reduce military strength. I guess this is now post World War II now, but I think that's something that, actually, my presentation certainly falls into here, and Christoph also flagged. Well, now that we tend to think of these geoeconomic tools as closer to the sanction side of, the negative threats, I actually do think that there's a reason to think that, throughout history and even going forward, the positive inducements may actually be more powerful. And so, to me, like the best application, or the most promising application, is something like the Marshall Plan, where it's essentially you are getting development financing in exchange for joining the U.S. led bloc. And I think that there's a sense in which the asks are so a bit more clearly self-interested with the recent swap line the U.S. has offered to Argentina. But that's a case where the U.S. is using its control of the international financial system. It's not using its power to cut off Argentina from the international financial system to get policy changes. It's instead identified an area where it is relatively cheap for the United States to offer an inducement to Argentina that it would using its existing relationship, that Argentina would have found very hard to get in and of itself, and going for an ask. And so I think that going back, the question is where you really want it for geoeconomics. The question is how much you want to draw the line for the positive inducements of take this action and you can have tariff preference in geoeconomics. I tend to, I do believe that's, would be included in kind of this history of geoeconomics. And I think the kind of lessons of history are that actually is probably the version that sustains power the longest, because with negative inducements, they're powerful at the moment, that if the more intertwined you are, the threat to take something away is very powerful. But once everybody knows that you're inclined to threaten to take things away period after period after period, that's where you have economic coercion and fragmentation, the desire to basically insulate yourself and move away. Whereas even if you know that the United States is going to use the dollar to extract a surplus from you now in the version of Argentina, if it is so efficient to basically get that money from the US, you might know that the US is still trying to stake some of the surplus and be fine with it. And so I think that, yes, we might not have had these explicit sanctions as much, but I do think that throughout history, you had a lot more of using the kind of positive inducements to change geopolitical behavior.
I think that's an excellent question that Kris posed here. But I would like to kind of enlarge the question and ask, well, why is it that we haven't seen aid back in the day? Why is it that we haven't seen bailouts on the same degree that we see today, right? We have a paper tracing government to government support over 200 years. And in that paper, we show that yes, there were, basically these bilateral flows, government to government, in crisis, and especially in wars, are, an old story. But it's much more institutionalized today, right? We have much more of that today. So in a sense, these kind of global public goods, both on the positive, like that's a positive spin, but the global coercion maybe also has a lot to do with that we've become much more accustomed, that the world has become much more intertwined politically also. And that, but I think we don't have great answers to this question. Why do we see maybe the globalization? I mean, Kris himself has worked a lot on globalization, and there's all these parallels, right? But the intensity of kind of interference, right, on the economic in the economic area, both on the positive dimensions that Jesse was emphasizing, aid and Marshall Plan and all these things, but also on the negative, like actual coercion. Um, that seems to have been more constrained, more also constrained to maybe military consideration. I was mentioning the cables. That was very much a military, domain to some degree. Espionage. Wanted to understand what goes on, what went over your cables. You wanted to cut those cables to punish your adversary. Um, so, this economic coercion, in a way, is has emerged in parallel to the economic, support and increasing provision of public goods in all sorts of arena, be it health or finance, or a currency cooperation. We've seen more of that. Maybe currency is one arena where there was more cooperation, but I think in other words, I think these are very big questions, and they also relate to kind of my call to think of these various instruments together and to think about the cost and benefits of them, right? So why would you use it now? What's the cost now? Why are you using which tools? And maybe the costs were different back in the day, right? But this could be one answer, but we know relatively little to answer that question.
Thank you both. The next question comes from Matteo Ficara and wants to know a little more about how Hirschman and perhaps the economists discussed in Ballard were thinking about the different types of defense spending. So, to put this in context, Matteo says, there's been a lot of political discussion today about what constitutes military spending. Is it local police forces? Is it building bridges in Italy? What should be counted, and, how should we think about the potential spillovers that come from military spending, such as research and development? In other words, the question is trying to get at the rationale and implications for the types of spending, and wants to know more about that.
I mean, Jesse, you want to start or should I?
And
Or okay,
go for, feel free.
okay. Yeah, I mean, again, I've shown this graph, with the rise of social spending and the fall of military spending. What I haven't shown is kind of like the category of civilian defense, right? That was big. It was really big back in the day. I mean, I don't know how much it was in the interwar or pre-World War One era, but it was certainly big in the Cold War area. All right. So when economists like von Neumann or these were thinking about these issues, it was clear that civilian defense, which is not what we would probably count to military defense spending today, these you're probably insinuating also to the 3.5% versus 1.5% in other infrastructure spending. So I think the 1.5% that NATO decided, the top on the pure defense spending, that another way to frame this, I think, is really civil defense. And I think it is right to, invest in civil defense. I think Finland is a good example of a country that has never stopped investing in civil defense. But the West has, I mean, most of the other Western countries has stopped to invest in civil defense. So in the 80s, we were preparing literally for war in all sorts of dimensions, stockpiling, right? I'm sure our stockpiles are, at least in Europe, are pretty much depleted. The ones in the US are probably fuller, but I'm sure that the Chinese ones are way better, set up. If there is a low probability of a very bad event happening, we are much less prepared than we were in the 80s. So I cannot answer to you how exactly, these economists were thinking about those other types of quasi-military spending or civil defense spending, but I can tell you that at the time it was seen as a very crucial complement to military spending. Having bunkers, having food stocks, having medicine, having emergency sites for the government, having proper infrastructure. We never think of infrastructure as something military, but it has always been in history, right? I mean, again, this is an history seminar, so most of you will be very aware that in a war you can't have a rail system like Germany's, which doesn't even work under in peacetime. That's not a luxury we should allow ourselves to have, right? So I think, I'm broadening up again here, but I think we should go again back to those kind of perspectives and take it more seriously
Yeah,
because
I
we're
think
faced with
so I agree with all that. The only thing I'll add here is I feel like a lot of what we're kind of reaching around for as we discuss, geoeconomics and military spending is this idea of where we're comfortable drawing the line between economic strength and military strength. There's a sense in which, like, you'll sometimes hear this from the US military that, the number one way in which, the US can maintain its military superiority is to have the largest economy. So there's a sense in which that gives you the broadest of, that's kind of the broadest rationale of anything that the United States does to maintain an economic lead above China. Is strengthen the national defense. So that's the broadest. I think that where we're now seeing a lot more movement is, it's not just, the so-called goods that are classified as dual use, but as we're really thinking of these kind of cutting edge technologies as, AI, semiconductors obviously comes to mind first and foremost, where we tend to think of those exact same factors that would give an economic edge in kind of the crucial industries are the exact same industries that we believe are going to give military superiority coming over the next several decades. And so even if you don't take the kind of wholesale, okay, anything that makes one country's GDP bigger than the other is giving it a military superiority, once you have this competition between great powers where the economic competition over technological superiority in these narrowly defined sectors are what we believe are the same exact technologies that are going to give military superiority over the next few years. Suddenly, that line between, economic and defense blurs quite a bit. And I think that that's underlying a lot of kind of the expansions of, US export controls on China, that moving from the kind of narrowly defined, FDPR restriction, not even that narrow, but single firm targeting of Huawei under the first administration to all of a sudden we're going to deny cutting edge, equipment to, the entire Chinese economy, blurring this line. And you hear kind of both rationales from policymakers of we need economic superiority, but also it's important for military superiority. I think that people are really struggling to see exactly where that line is given the nature of current technologies.
Okay, as usual, the chat or the Q&A starts filling up as we move closer to our witching hour. But let me see if I can get a couple of these broad questions in here because I think these are great to get both your input on. Tilo Albers asks, in the discussion you use support and coercion, both positive and negative, but I wonder where you draw the line uh, in those terms, thinking about post-war European construction, Chinese investment in Africa, what criteria, implicit or explicit, do you use to think about support versus coercion? So kind of trying to, get you guys to define the landscape a little more, particularly since you're the experts in this emerging field.
So, okay, I actually start with this theory paper we wrote with Kris and Matteo, this framework for geoeconomics paper, where we're able to get it pretty explicitly, which is an inducement or positive, a positive geoeconomic pressure is the country better off in the world where it says yes, then before any asks are made, than if the offer had not been made. So in the case of Argentina, Argentina is clearly better getting you're trying to change Argentina's action by offering it a swap line. Negative inducements are getting people to change their behavior with the idea of if you do not take a given action, we will make you worse off than you would have been otherwise. And so there, when in the beginning of the second Trump administration, when President Trump essentially threatens Colombia with a financial crisis by threatening 25% tariffs and full financial exclusion unless Colombia accepts migrant flights from the US. That's clearly negative inducement. And so at least for me, that's, conceptually how I tend to think of it. Is this basically saying, we can make you better off if you take this deal. Now, the hegemon and the great power may then take back that surplus by asking you to take actions. In the case of Argentina, it would be the ask appears to be, loosening relationships with China. That's at least where I draw the line on positive versus negative, and it's where I tend to put things like aid or swap lines in the positive camp. Clearly, I bet you can come up with examples where that's where you would have both at once. But that's how I tend to think of it in kind of a theory-driven way.
So yeah, that thanks a lot. I mean, I think this clarified a lot. Let me just emphasize, I mean, the two main arenas, I guess, for positive and negatives are trade and finance, international finance. So for trade, it's pretty obvious, you give preferential terms to some and you punish others. There you have the positive and negative. For finance, I think what's helpful is, again, drawing on our research agenda with Carmen Reinhardt and Sebastian Horn on official international finance, to think of all these different tools of bilateral financial flows that are state directed, that are from the sovereign together, right? So we tend to think of these as in silos, right? There's development aid, there's swap lines, there is kind of bailouts of Millet in the form of currency interventions, or direct treasury loans. But I think so. We are trying to push this idea that this is actually official finance. It's the other side of the coin of private capital flows. We know so much, hundreds and thousands of papers on private capital flows, very little on official flows. And once you put all these different pieces together, right? So lumping the Belt and Road, you mentioned that, Thilo, the Marshall Plan, aid, swap lines, all these different, even like bond purchases, all these different interventions together give you a much like these are all positive interventions. Of course, you can also maybe leverage that power negatively, but in principle, these are like supportive flows in crisis situation, mostly wars and financial crisis. Okay, and these wars and these flows are huge once you puzzle them together, right? So that's a definitional concept that we try to push here. That in finance. You can very clearly grasp these positive flows by looking at what we call official international finance.
So, one question that I think will serve to kind of wrap up our first part of our discussion, nicely encapsulates kind of the historical dimension of what you've been talking about. So Stefano Bartolozzi asks, historians use concepts such as informal imperialism, railway imperialism, and conquest by money to describe the interaction between rival powers and weak sovereign or semi-sovereign polities, having in mind places like China and the Ottoman Empire. Um, and in relation to that, how do you see the relationship between geoeconomics and these forms or dimensions of imperialism?
So, to me, at least the key way in which I tend to think of geoeconomics with my co-authors is our underlying basis for geoeconomic power is what we think of as a participation constraint. That for geoeconomic pressure, it requires the voluntary accession of the the party in which you're going, you're applying pressure. So in the case of ASML that I started with, the US goes to ASML and says, stop selling, EUV technology to China, or you'll be hit with the foreign direct product rule. But in that case, the company does have the option of saying, no, I will continue selling and I'll live with the sanctions. Similarly, when Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA, the German banks were hit with the possibility of stop dealing with Iran or you're cut off from the US, but the firms had to make the decision. I think when you think of, imperial relationships that are, I think that's where the participation constraint, the voluntary participation constraint might not be there because it is sustained by military coercion. There is no ability to say no. Now, in practice, I think that line is, tends to be fuzzier, that there are plenty of instances where you mentioned here that these kind of what we would call commercial imperialism is a form of geoeconomics. But to me, where I'm really focused on understanding how things are and what makes something geoeconomic pressure right now is this idea that is sustained by the ability to say no, and the power of the hegemon is essentially to shape the environment so that people don't want to say no, but the choice is there in a way that it is not there for military pressure.
Yeah, hold your thought for 1 second, Christoph, because I need to let people go at the top of the hour here, and then we're going to continue with the 15 minutes more of discussion of Q&A. Before people exit the room, I want to remind people that our next speaker is Aditi Sahasrabuddha from Brown University, speaking on the perils of technocratic power. So that's our next online seminar. Look forward to seeing you there, and we're going to continue the Q&A now informally. Christoph, feel free to continue our discussion on this current question if you like.
Yeah, briefly. I mean, I see. I would draw the line at national borders. I have a hard time in thinking about colonial relationship as geoeconomics. So I see this link. There has to be an international economic link, right? There has to be a cross-border link for me to think about a certain type of coercion or extraction as a geoeconomic link, right? So I wouldn't count colonies that relationship, but I would count the examples you gave on the Ottoman Empire or China, these quasi arrangement. I mean, surely the lines get fuzzier there, but there is an international economic dimensions between quasi sovereign, at least, states. So that's I think the line I would draw.
I want to ask one question since I very much enjoyed this panel, and my question kind of goes back to this new framing you had, Christoph, on constrained and unconstrained leaders, and I wonder if you can comment on the role of international institutions in constraining leaders, and is your perception that this dimension has emerged because those international institutions have weakened, or am I thinking about some dimension that is peripheral to how we should be, how you're thinking about that?
Yeah. So I do think that, I've become a bit more cynical the more I read about international institutions. And I guess Jesse in the recent paper that you have on international coercion might second me here because they have that element quite strongly in that international institutions are in a way a smart way of international power, a smart way of projecting power. There's this Eikenberry book after war that emphasizes basically the US voluntarily constraining itself via these international institutions because it helped the US in projecting power in confronting the communist side. Um, but that, the utility of that framework, the utility of these international organizations, of self-constraining yourself might not be as large as it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s, right? And that's um, in a way, so looking at our 200-year capital flow papers, I mean, the whole multilateral dimension is just one way to look at it is that, a loan by the World Bank or the IMF is just another way of bilateral lending, only via control in your coalition, in your sphere of influence. So it's basically the movie is very old and it's just one kind of a 40, 50, 70-year blip of history that we've done it in this way. And there's a possibility that, we will use that less, that this was kind of a technology by the hegemon, basically a US invention. And it's a question how long, this, if you want, technology of multilateralism is useful going forward, right? I mean, when I speak to German policymakers, they're still all in on it. They're still all in, but I see much less of that beyond many of the European countries. And also the willingness of say many emerging markets to engage there, to invest there in these old institutions is eroding. Maybe because the credibility of self-constraint by this organization, by the US, has so much eroded. I mean, they've said it explicitly, right? So in that sense, you can think of international organization as a geoeconomic tool of voluntary self-constraint to achieve higher international utility, higher international welfare. And for some reason, I mean, you can again, that would be another 10 minutes, but the utility of it seems to have gone down from a US perspective, at least. That's what the Trump administration says loud.
Rui, you look like you have your hand raised. Let's see how, um, I think you're,
Yes, I do.
yes,
Can you hear me?
yes.
And you can see me too. Good. This has been fantastic. Thank you very much. But this being the macro history webinar, there's one question I really want an answer from you guys, which is, where do you see history, economic history, contributing to this new field? Right? Of course, Christoph has been doing a lot of that from the Kiel group, Jesse the same. But you mentioned some unanswered questions and so on. They can be answered in many different ways. And I think the audience of this webinar would want to hear some thoughts on that line. And then a very quick one, right? Everyone mentioned multipolarism rather than multilateralism. Christoph, you finally mentioned hegemons, right? So maybe another way of thinking the field is, do you think that the field can say something about what would be in a non-multilateral but multipolar world, what would be the strategically stable configuration of multipolar world, right? So how many coalitions, right? Jesse confronted an American versus a Chinese coalition, but does that span the world? Is that the only possible stable equilibrium? And again, can history speak to that, right? And of course, I have in mind the interwar period where there was clearly, a unstable but multipolar world. Thank you.
You want to go first, Jesse?
Yeah, sure. So on the a bit unsatisfied on the coalition question. That's literally the theory paper we're trying to write right now. Right now, all the theory we've done is the single hegemon. Much more. There's much more to be done on the stability of this. I think that my conjecture right now is I don't know the in the absence of the Trump administration's tariff wars, I do think that there were very natural forces or very strong forces leading to two coalitions right now, in the sense that in the absence of the US kind of lashing out against all allies and countries, I would imagine that there'd be quite a bit more backlash against the, say, flood of Chinese imports in Europe. The US and Europe appear to be feeling that they're faced by similar geopolitical threats that I think are now a bit more muddled because of kind of the idiosyncratic actions of the Trump administration. As far as history, where I really actually there was another question in the chat. I saw that we didn't discuss on this. I think that the domestic political economy and how essentially throughout history, how you sustained political support for using your own firms for power projection, and which segments of society fought back against that kind of most decisively, to me is the big open question. I think that we kind of see now, there's a question of how much you can ask NVIDIA to do. They'll go right up to that, the threshold and move. But I think that often, geoeconomic power projection involves asking your own firms to potentially, your own firms or workers to sacrifice for this kind of nebulous geopolitical gain. And the stuff I'm trying to read up on is how, throughout history, we maintain kind of domestic political support for the use of geoeconomics as a policy tool. Because that's where I think we really know the least right now. And I think that there's a lot more that can be done going forward.
So I fully agree that we need to do more on the political economy of this, and history is indeed a good, very good, tool to leverage that. When our population is supportive of using sanctions, embargoes, of cutting off countries, of cutting off cables, cutting off infrastructure of other countries, right? I think history can be very, very important because, we've, in a way, the past 50, 60 years, as I said before, a bit of an exception, right? I mean, maybe we had the luxury to assume away the state, and, historians and economists working, 100 years ago didn't have that luxury. So I think we can learn about, multiple dimensions. There's this book, Training with Your Enemy, from on the 18th century, emphasizing that there were 8 wars between the UK and France in the 18th century, and yet they were signing trade agreements. They were trying to, foster globalization at the time between these countries. So how can you sustain international economic exchange despite these growing geopolitical tensions? And there, Rui's interwar year would be another. That's a destabilized era, but there are other eras where you had quite a bit of tension, and yet globalization was thriving. I mean, think of the pre-World War One era. So learning from history how, how policymakers, we can teach today's policymakers how to deal with such uncertainty and all these geopolitical shocks in a more informed way, right? So and that's, looking back to periods where geopolitical tensions and shocks and shifts were the norm rather than the exception, I think can be very, very valuable. That's true also for trade, right? I mean, we think of the Russian sanction as being quite extensive, but I mean, you look at, these history books, World War One and World War Two sanctions, that was, on a completely different scale. Trying to understand that, trying to understand how you can actually rearm, how you can scale up your military in this very ambitious way that policymakers are now aiming for. Again, history offers many, many examples, right? Think of the German buildup of the 1950s and 60s. Think of, all these other different buildups in the arena of trade. There were all sorts of sanctions and restrictions in the arena of capital flows as well, right? I mean, the Bismarck prohibited the placement of German bonds, of Russian bonds in German stock exchanges, right? So this was highly politicized back in the day, and there's a lot to learn from periods in which the state was intermingling with international finance, as it is starting to do again now, right? The central banks were loaded in the world wars with government bonds. Again, the situation that is reminiscent of today. So with all the tools you guys have now in terms of like leveraging historical data, I think there's so much that can be done. And I think maybe, yeah, I hope that some of the most exciting work in geoeconomics will come from history, from the long run, from looking at, exciting sub-periods, but also spanning these 200 years and trying to really understand the big trends, the predicaments, also in terms of multilateralism. So where are we now in our state of the world in terms of multilateral interactions? How much are we now investing in global political goods? We know that it's less than 20 years ago, but how much is it compared to the 50s and how much is it compared to the 20s? Right? So putting this in perspective, like, are we like, we're probably not in Armageddon mode at the moment. We're still in a very globalized, very cooperative world. So history can really, really help to put things in perspective, both on the size of sanctions and all these threat points, but also on the positives, the negatives and the positives, which keep on returning here. History can help a lot there.
Thank you. I hope people are listening or will listen later on. So
54 still.
Yeah, that might be a good place to leave things rather than trying to squeeze in one more question. I see Nathan coming up on the screen. Were you wanting to put another
I'm ready
question to
for the
them?
farewell part.
Yeah, but I wanted to thank both Christoph and Jesse for their excellent presentations and willingness to indulge us in an enormous number of questions that span space and time. And so it's been wonderful to get your perspectives on this important new area and fast-growing area. And thank you for encouraging me and others in the audience to pursue work in this area. I think it's been a pleasure to be part of it. And thank you again for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really great.
This was really fun. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.